The National Health Service has assumed ever greater importance in the national consciousness during the coronavirus crisis. It has certainly, in terms of the, for a time, weekly clap for the NHS on a Thursday evening, and also with the constant phrase National Health Service heroes, it has cemented its place as the jewel in the post-war crown. And it all started in 1948 with the setting up of the National Health Service, inaugurated on the 5th of July 1948. It was certainly a great day, but whilst there were celebrations as a state system was set up, we have to remember that we need to look for its origins at the beginning of the 20th century. Perhaps one of the significant events was the Minority Report of the Poor Law Commission of 1909, heavily influenced by Beatrice Webb. In it, she talked of the need for searching out diseases, securing the earliest possible diagnosis, taking hold of the incipient case, removing injurious conditions, applying specialised treatment, enforcing healthy surroundings and personal hygiene, and aiming always at preventing either recurrence or spread of disease, in contrast to the mere relief of the individual. In other words, what you had envisaged was both a preventative as well as a curative service. And one of the first steps towards this came under the National Insurance Act of 1911, which set up a national insurance scheme for workers in certain industries. They paid a stamp and they would go onto the panel of a doctor and were offered care within the competence of an ordinary practitioner. Now, it may have been limited in its scope, but it was the start of a state provision for primary health care. Lord Dawson, a later Minister of Health, and also physician to George V, was to describe the way in which a state medical service came about by instalments, almost by stealth. The state became involved in medicine in very different ways. At first, there was a school medical service set up by the 1906 Liberal government, which was dealing with the health of the next generation. If you like, it was creating little imperial assets. And as time went on, this was extended. School medical clinics were set up, mother and baby clinics. In 1917, a system of state-run, state-funded clinics for sufferers from venereal disease was set up. These clinics were paid for by the state. In many cases, They were located in existing voluntary hospitals who were paid to host them. And also, they gave the opportunity for, if you like, a free confidential service. And they were dealing with a national crisis, the need to deal with the prevalence of venereal disease in wartime, which was a threat to national efficiency. After the war, as part of that mood of building a land fit for heroes, a Ministry of Health was set up. And the state throughout the 1920s and 30s continued to extend its role in terms of healthcare. The hospitals were a different matter. In 1944, a white paper on the wartime emergency medical services shows the way in which the emergency medical services set up on the outbreak of war to deal with their military medical needs and also air raid precautions, had managed to merge a collection of individual hospitals into something of a related hospital system. Now, up to that time, there had been two types of hospital. The voluntary hospitals were charities for the deserving poor. If you were undeserving, you were sent to the workhouse. The voluntary hospitals depended on a vast array of fundraising measures. The workhouses were paid from the poor law rates and were run by boards of guardians, elected officials, so in effect local government. Also, in 1867, the Metropolitan Poor Act had set up asylums for the sick, insane and other classes of the poor, which were on a wider level covering the whole of the London metropolitan area. Well, by 1929, the workhouses were abolished, and the workhouse hospitals came under the governance of county councils and borough councils. And many of these councils raised the standards of the workhouse infirmaries to match those of the voluntary hospitals. But the two systems did not work together. However, cooperation in the emergency medical services in the Second World War brought them more closely together and demonstrated how a state system could work. In 1942, William Beveridge published his report on the social services. The Beveridge report was a bestseller, and people queued up to get copies. In terms of healthcare, which Beveridge thought has been an important part of the social services and vital for welfare and national health, health was to be a major part of the reforms. And it was said by Beveridge that a healthcare system should offer the best that science can do and make it available for the treatment of every citizen at home and in the institutions, irrespective of his personal means. So what you have is a comprehensive health service plan, free of charge, and available to all. The health of the community depended on the health of every citizen. And in order for this to be paid for by the state, you needed to have everybody on board. So it would be available to everybody, irrespective of whether they didn't have any money or whether they had so much money they could have afforded to provide healthcare for themselves and pay for it. These principles were carried forward in the 1944 White Paper, A National Health Service, issued by the coalition wartime government. And this said, everyone, irrespective of means, age, sex, occupation, shall have equal opportunity to benefit from the best and most up-to-date medical and allied services available. So a white paper had set out, if you like, the roadmap to a national health service. One that enjoyed support from all political parties. However, it was a Labour government that was to pass the National Health Service Act on the 6th of November 1944. And this was to lead to the establishment in England and Wales of a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvements in the physical and mental health of the people of England and Wales, and the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of illness. A separate act set up a separate National Health Service for Scotland. And again, it was to be comprehensive, it was to be free of charge, and it was to be preventative as well as therapeutic. Now, this couldn't be achieved without winning over the doctors. Younger doctors were more idealistic, and throughout the war had been thinking in terms of a state-funded universal health system. Older doctors, though, resistant to any idea of being nationalised. They didn't want to come under local government. They didn't want to be seen as civil servants. The voluntary hospitals wanted to keep their independence and didn't want to be municipalised. Younger doctors, though, had been sympathetic towards the arguments for a state system. Perhaps they were more idealistic. With military service, they also saw the need to provide for a better world. And they had seen, with the emergency medical service and other wartime measures, just how a system could work. Well, influential in winning over the older doctors was Lord Moran, President of the Royal College of Physicians, Dean of St Mary's Hospital Medical School, and nicknamed Corkscrew Charlie because he was devious. He was pitted against the Minister of Health, Nye Bevan. Lord Moran's approach was pragmatic. I felt that we would have a much greater say in things if we could establish a friendly approach to the minister. For he had a way of dividing the world into those who were for him and those who were against him. Well, the doctors were won over. The teaching hospitals retained a measure of their independence. A slush fund was set up to reward high-performing doctors, and also the GPs were to come under their own governance. They were to be independent employees. So they retained their independence. And indeed, so did hospital consultants. The big difference for all of them was that they would now be paid. And this would allow them to go forward with some measure of confidence in their professional status. The new National Health Service was to begin on the 5th of July, 1948. The public were informed that it will provide you with all medical, dental and nursing care. Everyone, rich or poor, man, woman or child, can use it, or any part of it. There are no charges except for a few special items. There are no insurance qualifications, but it is not a charity. You are all paying for it, mainly as taxpayers, and it will relieve your money worries in times of illness. Vesting Day was the 5th of July 1948. Nye Bevan attended Moss Side Hospital near Manchester to inaugurate the system. But it wasn't universally welcomed, as I said. On the 5th of July 1948, medical students put up a sign on the walls of St Mary's Hospital, Paddington, a memorial plaque. The old order changeth, yieldeth place to the new. In grateful and loving memory of St Mary's Hospital, born 1845, died July the 5th, 1948. Also of her brothers Bartholomew, Guy, Thomas and George, stricken down by the same contagion, R.I.P. Thy will be done on earth, as it were, by Bevan. Ironically, most of these doctors were to become some of the greatest supporters of the NHS in later years, when they saw just what it could do. In fact, one of the students who put that plaque up actually confessed to having been the perpetrator, but only in the late 1990s, when he wrote to me. Well, the standards of the voluntary hospitals were extended to the other hospitals. There was now no distinction. In many of the teaching hospitals, the only sign of the new order was that nursing salaries doubled. Shows how underpaid they had been before. But there was a great task to upgrade facilities. Also, there was the danger that this new free system would be abused. People waited until the National Health Service was set up before they went to an optician or the dentist, because they knew they would get care for nothing. They would get free spectacles, they would get free false teeth. Nye Bevan himself even said, "I shudder to think of the ceaseless cascade of medicine which is pouring down British throats at the present time." A cartoon showed a man having an eye test. On the chart, it says, "Would you be here if the glasses weren't free?" Well, it soon proved too expensive. And on the 1st of June 1952, prescription charges of £1 were introduced and a dental fee of £1. Several members of the cabinet resigned over the matter, including I. Bevan. Bevan himself conceded that we shall never have all we need. Expectations will always exceed capacity. The NHS must always be changing, growing and improving. It must always appear inadequate. In such a situation, it was necessary to stress that prevention was better than cure. And there were public health campaigns. Indeed, many years later, when Prime Minister Tony Blair in 2003 said, "We are clear that the government cannot and should not pretend it can make the population healthy, but it can and should support people in making better choices for their health." Now, for the first few years, there was a measure of stability within the health service. The structure did not change. But even as early as 1956, R.H. Turton, Minister of Health, was arguing that what is most needed at the present time is the prospect of a period of stability. However, it wasn't until 1974 that there was a great upheaval. And since that time, it has almost been constant revolution. So much so that in 2008, Ali Darzi, a surgeon, said, "My aim is to convince and inspire everyone working in the NHS and in partner organisations to embrace and lead change." Not all of the changes were welcome. In the 1960s, the Salmon Committee introduced a new, less hierarchical nursing structure. The matron was no longer the authoritarian head of a hospital nursing structure. Now, that meant that people nostalgically looked back to the time when there had been that strong leadership. And the Griffiths report of 1983 commented, "If Florence Nightingale were carrying her lamp through the corridors of the NHS today, she would almost certainly be searching for the people in charge." There were cries to bring back matron. But throughout the 72 years of the National Health Service, there have been many changes and improvements in medical services on offer. You can choose your own favourite ones. In 1948, the only child vaccinations was for smallpox and diphtheria. By 2008, they were for diphtheria, tetanus, polio, whooping cough, influenza, MMR, and meningitis C. Antibiotics revolutionised the fight against infectious diseases. Mass radiography made tuberculosis a fairly minor threat, though it has come back. The first United Kingdom kidney transplant was in 1960. In 1962, John Charnley performed the first hip replacement operation. The first United Kingdom heart transplant was performed by Donald Ross on the 3rd of May 1968. The CT scanner was introduced in 1971. The first test tube baby was born in 1978. MRI scans are now common. Breast screening campaigns were introduced from 1988. Keyhole surgery has revolutionised surgery, as has the Da Vinci remote robotic surgery. We could go on and on about all of these changes. But what were the results? Well, life expectancy rose. In 1948, it was 66 for men. It's now 71. For women in 1948, it was 77. Now it is 81. Meanwhile, infant mortality has gone down. And there have been great successes in reducing the causes of death. Tuberculosis is not a problem, but some diseases of modern affluence, such as cancer and heart disease, have obviously gone up. But meanwhile, the risk of tuberculosis is now minimal, and deaths from bronchitis and respiratory disease have gone down. The number of staff employed by the National Health Service has risen dramatically. In 1948, there were 144,000 health workers in the country. By 2016, 1.4 million. But it all comes at a cost. In 1948, the overall NHS budget for England and Wales was 437 million, which would be equivalent to 15 billion at today's value. By 2016, it was 116.4 billion. But I think it's interesting to compare the cost per head of population. In 1948, it cost £200 per man, woman and child. By 2018, this was £1,700 per person. It seems remarkably cheap. Now, Enoch Powell, although wrong on many things, was perhaps right when in 1961 he said, "We have to strive to alter our whole mentality about hospitals. Hospital building is not like pyramid building, the erection of memorials to endure to a remote posterity. As what is possible changes, then so do the demands, and buildings on their own are not sufficient. They need to adapt and change with time." Now, as recent years have shown, there will always be familiar problems to be overcome, but there will always be greater opportunities to achieve success, both now and in the future. Well, let's hope that recent days, hard and strange though they may have been, have shown that the health service is still up to all of those challenges. Thank you.